Chapter 12 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 12. Letter from Lucifer. I'm glad, Pat told herself. I'm glad it's over, and I'm glad I promised Dr. Carl. I guess I was mighty close to the brink of disaster that time. She examined the injuries on her face, carefully powdered to conceal the worst effects from her mother. The trick had worked, too. Mrs. Lane had delivered herself of an excited lecture on the dangers of the gasoline age, and then thanked heaven it was no worse. Well, Pat reflected, she had good old Dr. Carl to thank for the success of the subterfuge. He had broken the news very skillfully, set the stage for her appearance, and calmed her mother's apprehensions of scars. And Pat, surveying her image in the glass above her dressing table, could see for herself the minor nature of the hurts. Scars, pooh, she observed. A bruised cheek, a split lip, a skinned chin. All I need is a black eye, and I guess I'd have had that in 5 minutes more, and perhaps a cauliflower ear into the bargain. But her mood was anything but flippant. She was fighting off the time when her thoughts had of necessity to face the unpleasant, disturbing facts of the affair. She didn't want to think of the thing at all. She wanted to laugh it off and forget it, yet she knew that for an impossibility. The very desire to forget she recognized as a coward's wish, and she resented the idea that she was cowardly. Forget the wisecracks, she advised her image. Face the thing and argue it out. That's the only way to be satisfied. She rose with a little grimace of pain at the twinge from her bruised knees, and crossed to the chaise lounge beside the far window. She settled herself in it and resumed her cogitations. She was feeling more or less herself again. The headache of the morning had nearly vanished, and aside from the various headaches and a listless, fagged-out sensation, she approximated her normal self. Physically, that is. The shadow of that other catastrophe, the one she hesitated to face, was another matter. I'm lucky to get off this easily, she assured herself, after going on a bust like that one, like a lumberjack with his pay in his pocket. She shook her head in mournful amazement. And I'm Patricia Lane, the girl whom Billy dubbed Pat the Impeccable. Impeccable, wandering through alleys in step-ins and a tablecloth, getting beaten up in a drunken brawl, passing out on rot-gut liquor, being carried home and put to bed. Not impeccable. Incapable's the word. I belong to Dr. Carl's parade of incompetence. She continued her rueful reflections. Well, item 1 is, I don't love Nick anymore. I couldn't now, she flung at the smiling green Buddha on the mantel. That's over. I've promised. Somehow there was not satisfaction in the memory of that promise. It was logical, of course, there wasn't anything else to do now, but still. That wasn't Nick, she told herself. That wasn't my Nick. I guess Dr. Carl is right, and he's a depressed whatever it was, but if he's crazy, so am I. He had me convinced last night. I understood what he meant, and I felt what he wanted me to feel. If he's crazy, I am too. A fine couple we are. She continued, but it wasn't Nick. I saw his face when we drove off, and it had changed again, and that was Nick's face, not the other. And he was sorry. I could see he was sorry, and the other could never have regretted it. Not ever. The other isn't quite human, but Nick is. She paused, considering the idea. Of course, she resumed, I might have imagined that change at the end. I was hazy and quavery, and it's the last thing I do remember. That must have been just before I passed out. And then, replying to her own objection, but I didn't imagine it. I saw it happen once before, that other night when, well, what difference does it make anyway? It's over, and I've given my promise. But she was unable to dismiss the matter as easily as that. There was some uncanny, elusive element in it that fascinated her. Cruel, terrible, demonic, he might have been. He had also been kind, lovable, and gentle. Yet Dr. Carl had told her that split personalities could contain no characteristics that were not present in the original normal character. Was cruelty, then, a part of kindness? Was cruelty merely the lack of kindness? Or, cynical thought, was kindness but the lack of cruelty? Which qualities were positive in the antagonistic phases of Nicholas Devine's individuality, and which negative? Was the gentle, lovable, but indubitably weaker character the split, and the demon of last evening his normal self, or vice versa? Or were both of these fragmentary entities portions of some greater personality as yet unapparent to her? The whole matter was a mystery. She shrugged in helpless perplexity. I don't think Dr. Carl knows as much about it as he says, she mused. I don't think psychiatry or any other science knows that much about the human soul. Dr. Carl doesn't even believe in a soul. How could he know anything about it then? She frowned in puzzlement and gave up the attempt to solve the mystery. The hours she had spent in her room, at her mother's insistence, began to pall. She didn't feel particularly ill, it was more of a languor, a depressed, worn-out feeling. Her mother, of course, was out somewhere. She felt a desire for human companionship and wondered if the doctor might by some chance drop in. It seemed improbable. He had his regular Sunday afternoon routine of golf at the club, and it took a real catastrophe to keep him away from that. She sighed, stretched her legs, rose from her position on the chaise lounge, and wandered toward the kitchen where Magda was doubtless to be found. It was in the dusk of the rear hall that the first sense of her loss came over her. Heretofore her renunciation of Nicholas Devine was a rational thing, a promise given but not felt, but now it was suddenly a poignant reality. Nick was gone, she realized. He was out of her world, irrevocably sundered from her. She paused at the top of the rear flight of stairs, considering the matter. He's gone. I won't see him ever again. The thought was appalling. She felt already a premonition of loneliness to come, of an emptiness in her world, a lack that nothing could replace. I shouldn't have promised Dr. Carl, she mused, knowing that even without that promise her course must still have been the same. I shouldn't have, not until I talked to Nick, my own Nick. And still, she reflected forlornly, what difference did it make? She had to give him up. She couldn't continue to see him, not knowing at what instant that terrible caricature of him might appear to torment her. But he might have explained, she argued miserably, answering her own objection at once. He said he couldn't explain, didn't understand. The thing was at an impasse. She shook her shining black head despondently and descended the dusky well of the stairs to the kitchen. Magda was there clattering among her pots and pans. Pat entered quietly and perched on the high stool by the long table. Old Magda, who had warmed her babyhood milk and measured out her formula, gave her a single glance and continued her work. Sorry about the accident, she said without looking up. Thanks, responded the girl. I'm all right again. You don't look it. I feel all right. She watched the mysterious alchemistic mixing of a pastry and thought of the vast array of them that had come from Magda's hands. As far back as she could remember, she had perched on this stool observing the same mystic culinary rites. Suddenly another memory rose out of the grave of forgetfulness and went gibbering across her world. She remembered the stories Magda used to tell her, frightening stories of witchcraft and the evil eye, tales out of an older region and a more credulous age. Magda, she asked, did you ever see a devil? Not I, but I've talked with them that had. Didn't you ever see one? No, the woman slid a pan into the oven. I saw a man once when I was a tot, possessed by a devil. You did? How did he look? He screamed terrible. Then he said queer things. Then he fell down and foam came out of his mouth. Like a fit? The priest, he said it was a devil. He came and prayed over him, and after a while he was real quiet, and then he was all right. Possessed by a devil, said Pat thoughtfully. What happened to him? Dunno. What queer things did he say? Wicked things, the priest said. I couldn't tell. I was a tot. Possessed by a devil, Pat repeated musingly. She sat immersed in thoughts on the high stool while Magda clattered busily about. The woman paused finally, turning her face to the girl. What are you so quiet about, Miss Pat? I was just thinking. You get your letter? Letter? What letter? Today's Sunday. Special delivery. The girl, she put it in the hall. I didn't know anything about it. Who'd write me a special? She slipped off the high stool and proceeded to the front hall. The letter was there, solitary on the salver that always held the mail. She picked it up, examining the envelope in sudden, startled amazement and more than a trace of illogical exultation. For the letter, postmarked that same morning, was addressed in the irregular script of Nicholas Devine. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 13. Indecision. Pat turned the envelope dubiously in her hands, while a maze of chaotic thoughts assailed her. She felt almost a sensation of guilt, as if she were in some manner violating the promise given to Dr. Horker. She felt a twinge of indignation that Nicholas Devine should dare communicate with her at all, and she felt too that queer exultation, an inexplicable pleasure, a feeling of secret triumph. She slipped the letter in the pocket of her robe and padded quietly up the stairs to her own room. Strangely, her loneliness had vanished. The great house, empty now save for herself and Magda in the distant kitchen, was no longer a place of solitude. The discovery of the letter, whatever its contents, had changed the deserted rooms into chambers teeming with her own excitements, trepidations, doubts, and hopes. Even hopes, she admitted to herself, though hopes of what nature she was quite unable to say. What could Nick write that had the power to change things? Apologies? Pleas? Promises? None of these could alter the naked, horrible facts of the predicament. Nevertheless, she was almost a-tremble with expectation as she skipped hastily into her own room, carefully closed the door, and settled herself by the west windows. She drew the letter from her pocket, and then, with a tightening of her throat, tore open the envelope, slipping out the several pages of scrawled paper. Avidly she began to read. "I don't know whether you'll ever see this," the missive began without salutation, "and I'll not blame you, Pat dear, if you do return it unopened. There's nothing that you can do that wouldn't be justified, nor can you think worse of me than I do of myself. And that's a statement so meaningless that even as I wrote it, I could anticipate its effect on you. Pat, how am I going to convince you that I'm sincere? Will you believe me when I write that I love you? Can you believe that I love you tenderly, worshipfully, reverently? You can't. I know you can't after that catastrophe of last night. But it's true, Pat, though the logic of a Spinoza might fail to convince you of it. I don't know how to write you this. I don't know whether you want to hear what I could say, but I know that I must try to say it. Not apologies, Pat. I shouldn't dare approach you for so poor a reason as that, but a sort of explanation. You more than anyone in the world are entitled to that explanation if you want to hear it. I can't write it to you, Pat. It's something I can only make you believe by telling you, something dark and rather terrible. But please, dear, believe that I mean you no harm, and that I plan no subterfuge when I suggest that you see me. It will be, I think, for the last time. Tonight and tomorrow night, and as many nights to follow as I can, I'll sit on a bench in the park near the place where I kissed you that first time. There will be people passing there and cars driving by. You need fear nothing from me. I choose the place to bridle my own actions, Pat. Nothing can happen while we sit there in the view of the world. To write you more than this is futile. If you come, I'll be there. If you don't, I'll understand. I love you." The letter was signed merely Nick. She stared at the signature with feelings so confused that she forbore any attempt to analyze them. "But I can't go," she mused soberly. "I've promised Dr. Carl. Or at least, I can't go without telling him." That last thought, she realized, was a concession. Heretofore she hadn't let herself consider the possibility of seeing Nicholas Devine again, and now suddenly she was weakening, arguing with herself about the ethics of seeing him. She shook her head decisively. "Won't do, Patricia Lane," she told herself. "Next thing you'll be slipping away without a word to anybody and coming home with 2 black eyes and a broken nose. Won't do at all." She dropped her eyes to the letter. Explanations, she reflected. I guess Dr. Carl would give up a hole-in-one to hear that explanation. And I'd give more than that. She shook her head regretfully. Nothing to do about it, though. I promised. The sun was slanting through the west windows. She sat watching the shadows lengthen in the room and tried to turn her thoughts into more profitable channels. This was the first Sunday in many months that she had spent alone in the house. It was a custom for herself and her mother to spend the afternoon at the club. The evening, too, as a rule, there was invariably bridge for Mrs. Lane, and Pat was always the center of a circle of the younger members. She wondered dreamily what the crowd thought of her non-appearance, reflecting that her mother had doubtless enlarged on Dr. Carl's story of an accident. Dr. Carl wouldn't say much, simply that he'd ordered her to stay at home. But sooner or later Nick would hear the accident story. She wondered what he'd think of it. She caught herself up sharply. My ideas wander in circles, she thought petulantly. No matter where I start, they curve around back to Nick. It won't do. I've got to stop it. Nearly time for the evening meal, she mused, watching the sun as it dropped behind Dr. Horker's house. She didn't feel much like eating. There was still a remnant of the exhausted, dragged-out sensation, though the headache that had accompanied her awakening this morning had disappeared. I know what the morning after feels like anyway, she reflected with a wry little smile. Everybody ought to experience it once, I suppose. I wonder how Nick... She broke off abruptly, with a shrug of disgust. She slipped the letter back into its envelope, rose, and deposited it in the drawer of the night table. She glanced at the clock ticking on its shiny top. 6 o'clock, she murmured. Nick would be sitting in the park in another 2 hours or so. She had a twinge of sympathy at the thought of his lone vigil. She could visualize the harried expression on his face when the hours passed without her arrival. Can't be helped, she told herself. He's no right to ask for anything of me after last night. He knows that. He said so in his letter. She suppressed an impulse to reread that letter and trotted deliberately out to the room and down the stairs. Magda had set the table in the breakfast room. It was far cozier than the great dining room, especially without her mother's company, and the maid was away. The breakfast room simplified serving as well. She tried valorously to eat what Magda supplied, but the food failed to tempt her. It wasn't so much her physical condition either. It was... She clenched her jaws firmly. Was the memory of Nicholas Devine to haunt her forever? Pat Lane, she said in admonition. You're a crack-brained fool. Just because a man kicks you all over the place is no reason to let him become an obsession. She drank her coffee, feeling the sting of its heat on her injured lips. She left the table, tramped firmly to her room, and began defiantly to read. The effort was useless. Half a dozen times she forced her attention to the page, only to find herself staring vaguely into space a moment or two later. She closed the book finally with an irritable bang, and vented her restlessness in pacing back and forth. This house is unbearable, she snapped. I'm not going to stay shut up here like a jailbird in solitary confinement. A walk in the open is what I need, and that's what I'll have. She glanced at the clock. 7:30. She tore off her robe pettishly, flung out of her pajamas, and began to dress with angry determination. She refused to think of a lonely figure that might even now be sitting disconsolately on a bench in the nearby park. She disguised her bruised cheek as best she could, dabbed a little powder on the abrasion on her chin, and tramped militantly down the stairs. She caught up her wrap, still lying where the doctor had tossed it last night, and moved toward the door, opening it and nearly colliding with the massive figure of Dr. Horker. Well, boomed the doctor as she stared back in surprise, you're pretty spry for a patient. Think you were going out? Yes, said Pat defiantly. Not tonight, child. I left the club early to take a look at you. I am perfectly all right. I want to go for a walk. No walk. Doctor's orders. I'm of legal age, she snapped. I want to go for a walk. Do I go? You do not. The doctor placed his great form squarely in the doorway. Not unless you can lick me, my girl, and I'm pretty tough. I put you to bed last night, and I can do as much tonight. Shall I? Pat backed into the hall. You don't have to, she said sullenly. I'm going there myself. She flung her wrap angrily to a chair and stalked up the stairs. Good night, Spitfire, he called after her. I'll read down here until your mother comes home. The girl stormed into her room in anger that she knew to be illogical. I won't be watched like a problem child, she told herself viciously. I know damn well what he thought, and I wasn't going to meet Nick. I wasn't at all. She calmed suddenly, sat on the edge of her bed, and kicked off her pumps. It had occurred to her that Nick had written his intention to wait for her in the park tomorrow night as well, and Dr. Horker's interference had confirmed her in a determination to meet him. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 14. Bizarre Explanation. I won't be bullied, Pat told herself, examining her features in the mirror. The 2-day interval had faded the discoloration of her cheek to negligible proportions, and all that remained as evidence of the violence of Saturday night was the diminishing mark on her chin. Of course, her knees, but they were covered most of the time at least. She gave herself a final inspection, and somewhere below a clock boomed. 8 o'clock, she remarked to her image. Time to be leaving, and it serves Dr. Carl right for his high-handed actions last night. I won't be bullied by anybody. She checked herself as her mind had almost added, except Nick. True or not, she didn't relish the thought. The recent recollections it roused were too disturbing. She tossed a stray wisp of black hair from her forehead and turned to the door. She heard her mother's voice as she descended the stairs. "Are you going out, Patricia? Do you think it wise?" "I'm perfectly all right. I want to go for a walk." "I know, dear. It was largely your appearance I meant." She surveyed the girl with a critical eye. "Nice enough, except for that little spot on your chin, and will you never learn to keep your hair away from that side of your forehead? One can never do a bob right. Why don't you let it grow out like the other girls?" "Makes me individual," replied Pat, moving toward the outer door. "I won't be late at all," she added. On the porch she cast a cautious glance at Dr. Horker's windows, but his great figure was nowhere evident. Only a light burning in the library evinced his presence. She gave a sigh of relief and tiptoed down the steps to the sidewalk and moved hastily away from the range of his watchful eyes. No sooner had she sighted the park than doubts began to torment her. Suppose this were some trick of Nicholas Devine's to trap her into some such situation as that of Saturday night. Even suppose that she found him the sweet personality that she had loved. Might that also be a trick? Mightn't he be trusting to his ability to win her over, to the charm she had confessed to him that he held for her? Couldn't he be putting his faith in his own amorous skill, planning some specious explanation to win her forgiveness, only to use her once more as the material for some horrible experiment? And if he were, would she be able to prevent herself from yielding? Forewarned is forearmed, she told herself. I'll not put up such a feeble resistance this time, knowing what I now know, and it's only fair of me to listen to his explanation if he really has one. She was reassured by the sight of the crowded park. Groups strolled along the walks, and an endless procession of car headlights marked the course of the roadway. Nothing could happen in such an environment. They'd be fortunate even to have an opportunity for confidential talk. She waited for the traffic lights, straining her eyes to locate Nicholas Devine. At the click of the signal, she darted across the street. She moved toward the lake. Here was the spot, she was sure. She glanced about with eagerness unexpected even to herself, peering through the shadow-shot dusk. He wasn't there, she concluded, with a curious sense of disappointment. Her failure to appear last night had disheartened him. He had abandoned his attempt. Then she saw him. He sat on a bench, isolated from the rest in a treeless area overlooking the lake. She saw his disconsolate figure, his chin on his hand, staring moodily over the waters. A tremor ran through her. She halted deliberately, waiting until every trace of emotion had vanished. Then she advanced, standing coolly beside him. For a moment he was unaware of her presence. He sat maintaining his dejected attitude without glancing at her. Suddenly, some slight movement, the flutter of her skirt, drew his attention. He turned sharply, gazing directly into her face. "Pat!" He sprang to his feet. "Pat, is it you? Truly you? Or are you one of these visions that have been plaguing me for hours?" "I'm real," she said, returning his gaze with a studied coolness in her face. She made no other move. Her cold composure disconcerted him, and he winced, flushed, and moved nervously aside as she seated herself. He dropped beside her. He made no attempt to touch her, but sat watching her in silence for so long a time that she felt her composure ebbing. There was a hungry, defeated look about him. There was a wistfulness, a frustration in his eyes that seemed about to tug tears from her own eyes. Abruptly, she dropped her gaze from his face. "Well," she said finally in a small voice, and as he made no reply, "I'm here." "Are you really, Pat? Are you truly here?" he murmured, still watching her avidly. I still don't believe it. I waited here for hours and hours last night, and I'd given up hope for tonight, or any night. But I would have come again and again." She started as he bent suddenly toward her, but he was merely examining her face. She saw the gleam of horror in his expression as his eyes surveyed the faintly visible bruise on her cheek, the red mark on her chin. "Oh my God, Pat." His words were barely audible. "Oh my God," he repeated, drawing away from her and resuming the attitude of desolation in which her arrival had found him. "I've hoped it wasn't true." "What wasn't?" She was keeping her voice carefully casual. This miserable contrition of Nick's was tugging at her rather too powerfully for complete safety. "What I remembered, what I saw just now." "You hoped it wasn't true?" she queried in surprise. "But you did it." "I did it, Pat." "Do you think I could have done it?" "But you did!" Her voice had taken on a chill inflection. The memory of those indignities came to steel her against him. "Pat, do you think I could assault your daintiness, or maltreat the beauty I worship? Didn't anything occur to you? Didn't anything seem queer about that ghastly evening?" "Queer," she echoed. "That's certainly a mild word to use, isn't it?" "But I mean, hadn't you any idea of what had happened? Didn't you think anything of it except that I had suddenly gone mad, or that I'd grown to hate you?" "What was I to think?" she countered, trying to control the tremor that had crept into her voice. "But did you think that?" "No," the girl confessed after a pause. "At first, when you started with that drink, I thought you were looking for material for your work. That's what you said, an experiment. Didn't you?" "I guess so," he groaned. "But after that, after I'd swallowed that horrible stuff, but before everything went hazy, I thought differently." "But what, Pat? What did you think?" "Why, then I realized that it wasn't you, not the real you. I could feel the presence of the person I knew. This present that was tormenting me was another person, a terrible, cold, inhuman stranger." "Pat!" There was a note almost of relief in his voice. "Did you really feel that?" "Yes. Does it help matters, my sensing that? I can't see how." His eyes, which had been fixed on hers, dropped suddenly. "No," he muttered, all the relief gone out of his tones. "No, it doesn't help, does it? Except that it's a meager consolation to me to know that you felt it." Pat struggled to suppress an impulse to reach out her hand, to stroke his hair. She caught herself sharply. This was the very danger against which she had warned herself. This was the very attitude she had anticipated in Nicholas Devine, the lure which might bait a trap. Yet he looked so forlorn, so wistful. It was an effort to forbear from touching him. Her fingers fairly ached to brush his cheek. "Only a fool walks twice into the same trap," she told herself. Aloud she said, "You promised me an explanation. If you've any excuse, I'd like to hear it." Her voice had resumed its coolness. "I haven't any excuse," he responded gloomily, "and the explanation is perhaps too bizarre, too fantastic for belief. I don't believe it entirely. I suppose you couldn't believe it at all." "You promised," she repeated. The carefully assumed composure of her voice threatened to crack. This wistfulness of his was a powerful weapon against her defense. "Oh, I'll give you the explanation," he said miserably. "I just wanted to warn you you'd not believe me." He gave her a despondent glance. "Pat, as I love you, I swear that what I tell you is the truth. Do you think you could believe me?" "Yes," she murmured. The tremor had reappeared in her voice despite her efforts. Nicholas Devine turned his eyes toward the lake and began to speak. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 15. A Modern Mr. Hyde. I don't remember when I first noticed it, began Nick in a low voice. But I'm two people. I'm me, the person who's talking to you now, and I'm another. Pat, looking very pale and serious in the dusky light, said nothing at all. She simply gazed at him silently, without the slightest trace of surprise in her wide, dark eyes. "This is the real me," proceeded Nick miserably. "The other is an outsider that has somehow contrived to grow into me. He's different. Cold, cruel, utterly selfish, and not exactly human. Do you understand?" "Yes," said the girl, fighting to control her voice. "Sort of." "This is a struggle that has continued for a long time," he pursued. "There were times in childhood when I remember punishments for offenses I never committed, for nasty little meannesses he perpetrated. My mother, and after her death, my tutoress, thought I was lying when I tried to explain. They thought I was trying to evade responsibility. After a while, I learned not to explain. I learned to accept my punishments doggedly and to fight this other when he sought dominance." "And could you?" asked Pat, her voice frankly quavery. "Could you fight him?" "I was the stronger. I could win, usually. He slipped into consciousness as willful, mean little impulses, nasty moods, unreasoning hates, and such unpleasant things. But I was always the stronger. I learned to drive him into the background." "You said you were the stronger," she mused. "What does that mean, Nick?" "I've always been the stronger. I am now. But recently, Pat, I think it's since I fell in love with you, the struggle has been on evener terms. I've weakened where he's gained. I have to guard against him constantly. In any moment of weakness he may slip in, as on our ride last week when we had that near accident, and again Saturday." He turned appealing eyes on the girl. "Pat, do you believe me?" "I guess I'll have to," she said unhappily. "It makes things rather hopeless, doesn't it?" He nodded dejectedly. "Yes. I've always felt that sooner or later I'd win and drive him away permanently. I've felt on the verge of complete victory more than once, but now—" He shook his head doubtfully. "He had never dominated me so entirely until Saturday night. Pat, you don't know what hell is like until you're forced as I was to watch the violation of the being you worship, to stand helpless while a desecration is committed. I'd rather die than suffer it again." "Oh," said the girl faintly. She was thinking of the sorry picture she must have presented as she reeled half clothed through the alley. "Can you see what he sees?" "Of course, and think his thoughts, but only when he's dominant. I don't know what evil he's planning now, else I could forestall him. I would have warned you if I could have known." "Where is he now?" "Here," said Nick somberly. "Here, listening to us, knowing what I'm thinking and feeling, laughing at my unhappiness." "Oh," gasped Pat again. She watched her companion doubtfully. Then the memory of Dr. Horker's diagnosis came to her and set her wondering. Was this story the figment of an unsettled mind? Was this irrational tale of a fiendish intruder merely evidence that the doctor was right in his opinion? She was in a maze of uncertainty. "Nick," she said, "did you ever try medical help? Did you ever go to a doctor about it?" "Of course, Pat. 2 years ago I went to a famous psychiatrist in New York. You'd know the name if I mentioned it, and told him about the case. And he studied me, and he treated me, and psychoanalyzed me, and the net result was just nothing. And finally he dismissed me with the opinion that the whole thing is just a fixed delusion, fortunately harmless. Harmless! Bah! But it wasn't I that did those things, Pat. I had to stand by in horror and watch. It was enough to drive me crazy, but it didn't, quite." "But oh, Nick, what is it? what is this outsider? Can't we fight it somehow? How can anyone except me fight it? Oh, I don't know, she wailed miserably. There must be a way. Doctors claim to know pretty nearly everything. There must be something to do. But there isn't, he retorted gloomily. I don't know any more than you what this thing is, but it's beyond your doctors. I've got to fight it out alone. Nick, her voice was suddenly tense. Are you sure it isn't some kind of madness? Something tangible like that could perhaps be treated. It's no kind your doctors can treat, Pat. Did you ever hear of a madman who stood aside and rationally watched the working of his own insanity? And that's what I'm forced to do. And yet, this other isn't insane either. Were its actions insane? Pat shuddered. I don't know, she said in low tones. I guess not. No. Horrible, cruel, bestial, devilishly cunning, evil, but not insane. I don't know what it is, Pat. I know that the fight has to be made by me alone. There's nothing, nobody in the world, that can help. Nick, she wailed. I'm sorry, Pat dear. You understand now why I was so reluctant to fall in love with you. I was afraid to love you. Now I know I was right. Nick, she cried, then paused hopelessly. After a moment she continued. Yesterday I was determined to forget you, and now I don't care if this whole tale of yours is a mesh of fantastic lies. I love you. I'd love you even if your real self were that other creature, and even if I knew that this was just a trap. I'd love you anyway. Pat, he said seriously, don't you believe me? Why should I offer to give you up if this were what you said? Wouldn't I be pleading for another chance, making promises, finding excuses? Oh, I believe you, Nick. It isn't that. I was just thinking how strange it is that I could hate you so 2 nights past and love you so tonight. Oh, God, Pat, even you can't know how much I love you, and to win you and then be forced to give you up. He groaned. The girl reached out her hand and covered his. It was the first time during the evening she had touched him, and the feel of his flesh sent a tingle through her. She was miserably distraught. Honey, she murmured brokenly. Nick, honey. He looked at her. Do you suppose there's a chance to beat the thing? He asked. I'd not ask you to wait, Pat. But if I only glimpsed a chance. I'll wait. I don't think I could do anything else but wait for you. If I only knew what I had to fight, he whispered. If I only knew that. A sudden memory leaped into Pat's mind. Nick, she said huskily, I think I know. What do you mean, Pat? It's something Magda, the cook, said to me. It's foolish, superstitious, but Nick, what else can it be? Tell me. Well, she was talking to me yesterday, and she said that when she was a child in the old country, she had seen a man once. She hesitated. A man who was possessed by a devil. Nick, I think you're possessed by a devil. He stared at her. Pat, he said hoarsely, that's an impossibility. I know, but what else can it be? Out of the dark ages, he muttered, an echo of the Black Mass and witchcraft, but what did they do, asked the girl, to people they thought were possessed? Exorcism, he whispered. And how did they exorcise? I don't know, he said in a low voice. Pat, that's an impossible idea, but I don't know, he ended. We'll try, she murmured, still covering his hand with her own. What else can we do, Nick? What's done, I'll do alone, Pat. But I want to help. I'll not let you, dear. I won't have you exposed to a repetition of those indignities, or perhaps worse. I'm not afraid. Then I am, Pat. I won't have it. But what'll you do? I'll go away. I'll battle the thing through once for all. And I'll either come back free of it, or... He paused, and the girl did not question him further, but sat staring at him with troubled eyes. I won't write you, Pat, he continued. If you should receive a letter from me, burn it. Don't read it. It might be from the other, a trap or a lure of some sort. Promise me. You'll promise that, won't you?" She nodded. There was a glint of tears in her eyes. "And I don't want you to wait, Pat," he proceeded. "I don't want you to feel that you have any obligations to me. God knows you've nothing to thank me for. If I come back and you haven't changed, then we'll try again." "Nick," she said in a small voice, "how do you know the other won't come back here? How can you promise for it?" "I'm still master," he said grimly. "I won't be dominated long enough at any time for that to happen. I'll fight it down." "Then it's goodbye?" He nodded. "But not for always, I hope." "Nick," she murmured, "will you kiss me?" She felt a tear on her cheek. "I'll stand losing you a little better if I can have a last kiss to remember." Her voice was faltering. His arms were about her. She yielded herself completely to his caress. The park, the crowd passing a few yards away, the people on nearby benches, were all forgotten, and once more she felt herself alone with Nicholas Devine in a vast, empty cosmos. An insistent voice penetrated her consciousness. She realized that it had been calling her name for some seconds. "Miss Lane," she heard, and again, "Miss Lane." A hand tapped her shoulder. With a sudden start she tore her lips away and looked up into a face unrecognized for a moment. Then she placed it. It was the visage of Mueller, Dr. Horker's companion on that disastrous Saturday night. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Begeman, Somerville, South Carolina. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 16. Possessed. Pat stared at the intruder in a mingling of embarrassment, perplexity, and indignation. She felt her cheeks reddening as the latter emotion gained the dominance of her mood. "Well," she snapped, "what do you want?" "I thought I'd walk home with you," Mueller said amiably. "Walk home with me? Please explain that." She grasped the arm of Nicholas Devine, who had risen angrily at the interruption. "Sit down, Nick. I know the fellow." "So should he," said Mueller. "Sure, I'll explain. I'm on a job for Dr. Horker." "Spying on me for him, I suppose," taunted the girl. "No, not on you." "He means on me," said Nick soberly. "You can't blame him, Pat, and perhaps you had better go home. We've finished here. There's nothing more we can do or say." "Very well," she said, her voice suddenly softer. "In a moment, Nick." She turned to Mueller. "Would you mind telling me why you waited until now to interfere? We've been here 2 hours, you know." "Sure, I'll tell you. I got no orders to interfere. That's why." "Then why did you?" queried Pat tartly. "I didn't until I saw him there." He nodded at Nick. "Put his arms around you. Then I figured, having no orders, it was time to use my own judgment." "If any," sniffed the girl. She turned again to Nick. Her face softened, became very tender. "Honey," she murmured huskily, "I guess it's goodbye now. I'll be fighting with you, you know that." "I know that," he echoed, looking down into her eyes. "I'm almost happy, Pat." "When'll you go?" she whispered in tones inaudible to Mueller. "I don't know," he answered, his voice unchanged. "I'll have to make some sort of preparations, and I don't want you to know." She nodded. She gazed at him a moment longer with tear-bright eyes. "Goodbye, Nick," she whispered. She rose on tiptoe and kissed him very lightly on his lips, then turned and walked quickly away, with Mueller following behind. She walked on, ignoring him until he halted beside her at the crossing of the drive. Then she gave him a cold glance. "Why is Dr. Carl having him watched?" she asked. Mueller shrugged. "The ins and outs of this case are too much for me," he said. "I do what I'm paid to do." "You're not watching him now." "Nope. Seemed like the doctor would think it was more important to get you home." "You're wasting your time," she said irritably, as the lights changed and they stepped into the street. "I was going home anyway." "Well, now you got company all the way." Mueller's voice was placid. The girl sniffed contemptuously and strode silently along. The other's presence irritated her. She wanted time and solitude to consider the amazing story Nicholas Devine had given her. She wanted to analyze her own feelings, and most of all she wanted just a place of privacy to cry out her misery. For now the loss of Nicholas Devine had changed from a fortunate escape to a tragedy, and liar, madman, or devil, she wanted him terribly, with all the power of her tense little heart. So she moved as swiftly as she could, ignoring the silent companionship of Mueller. They reached her home. The light in the living room window was evidence that the bridge game was still in progress. She mounted the steps, Mueller watching her silently from the walk. She fumbled for her key. Suddenly she snapped her handbag shut. She couldn't face her mother and the two spinster Brocks and elderly, inquisitive Carter Henderson. They'd suggest that she cut into the game, and they'd argue if she refused, and she couldn't play bridge now. She glanced at the impassive Mueller, turned and crossed the strip of lawn to Dr. Horker's residence, where the light still glowed in the library, and rang the bell. She saw the figure on the sidewalk move away as the shadow of the doctor appeared on the lighted square of the door. "Hello," boomed the doctor amiably. "Come in." Pat stalked into the library and threw herself angrily into Dr. Horker's particular chair. The other grinned and chose another place. "Well," he said, "what touched off the fuse this time?" "Why are you spying on my friends?" snapped the girl. "By what right?" "So he's spotted Mueller, eh? That lad's diabolically clever, Pat, and I mean diabolic." "That's no answer." "So it isn't," agreed the doctor. "Say it's because I'm acting in loco parentis." "And in loco is as far as you'll get, Dr. Carl, if you're going to spy on me." "On you?" he said mildly. "Who's spying on you?" "On us, then." "Or on us?" queried the doctor. "I set Mueller to watch the Devine lad. Have you by some mischance broken your promise to me?" Pat flushed. She had forgotten that broken promise. The recollection of it suddenly took the wind from her sails, placed her on the defensive. "All right," she said defiantly. "I did. I admit it. Does that excuse you?" "Perhaps it helps to explain my actions, Pat. Don't you understand that I'm trying to protect you? Do you think I hired Mueller out of morbid curiosity or professional interest in the case? Times aren't so good that I can throw money away on such whims." "I don't need any protection. I can take care of myself." "So I noticed," said the doctor dryly. "You gave convincing evidence of it night before last." "Oh!" said the girl in exasperation. "You would say that." "It's true, isn't it?" "Suppose it is. I don't have to learn the same lesson twice." "Well, apparently once wasn't enough," observed the other amiably. "You walked into the same danger tonight." "I wasn't in any danger tonight." Suddenly her mood changed as she recalled the circumstances of her parting with Nicholas Devine. "Dr. Carl," she said, her voice dropping, "I'm terribly unhappy." "Lord!" he exclaimed, staring at her. "Pat, your moods are as changeable as my golf game. You're as mercurial as your Devine lad. A moment ago you were snapping at me, and now I'm suddenly acceptable again." He perceived the misery in her face. "All right, child, I'm listening." "He's going away," she said mournfully. "Don't you think that's best for everybody concerned? I commend his judgment." "But I don't want him to." "You do, Pat. You can't continue seeing him, and his absence will make it easier for you." "It'll never be easier for me, Dr. Carl." She felt her eyes fill. "I guess I'm just a fool about him." "You still feel that way, after the experience you went through?" Yes, I do." "Then you are a fool about him, Pat. He's not worth such devotion." "How do you know what he's worth? I'm the only one to judge that." "I have eyes," said the doctor. "What happened tonight to change your attitude so suddenly? You were amenable to reason yesterday." "I didn't know yesterday what I know now." "So he told a story, eh?" The doctor watched her serious, troubled features. "Would you mind telling me, honey? I'm interested in the defense mechanisms these psychopathic cases erect to explain their own impulses to themselves." "No, I won't tell you," snapped Pat indignantly. "Psychopathic cases? We're all just cases to you. I'm a case, and he's another, and all you want is our symptoms." Dr. Horker smiled placatingly into her face. "Pat, dear," he said earnestly, "don't you see I'd give my eyes to help you? Don't take my flippancies too seriously, honey. Look once in a while at the intentions behind them." He continued his earnest gaze. The girl returned his look. Her face softened. "I'm sorry," she said contritely. "I never doubted it, Dr. Carl. It's only that I'm so torn to pieces by all this that I get snappy and irritable." She paused. "Of course, I'll tell you." "I'd like to hear it." "Well," she began hesitantly, "he said he was two personalities. One the character I knew, and one the character that we saw Saturday night. And the first one is, well, dominant, and fights the other one. He says the other has been growing stronger, until lately he could suppress it. And he says, oh, it sounds ridiculous the way I tell it, but it's true. I'm sure it's true." She leaned toward the doctor. "Did you ever hear of anything like it? Did you, Dr. Carl?" "No." He shook his head, still watching her seriously. "Not exactly like that, honey. Don't you think he might possibly have lied to you, Pat, to excuse himself for the responsibility of Saturday night, for instance?" "No, I don't," she said defiantly. "Then you have an idea yourself what the trouble is. I judge you have." "Yes," she said in low tones, "I have an idea." "What is it?" "I think he's possessed by a devil," said the girl flatly. A quizzical expression came into the doctor's face. "Well, of all the queer ideas that harum-scarum mind of yours has ever produced, that's the queerest." He broke into a chuckle. "Queer, is it?" flared Pat. "I don't think you and your mind doctors know as much as a Swahili medicine man with a mask." She leaped angrily to her feet, stamped viciously into the hall. "Devil and all," she repeated. "I love him." "Pat," called the doctor anxiously. "Pat, where are you going, child?" "Where do devils live?" Her voice floated tauntingly back from the front door. "Hell, of course." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Somerville, South Carolina. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 17. Witch Doctor. Pat had no intentions, however, of following the famous highway that evening. She stamped angrily down the doctor's steps, swished her way through the break in the hedge with small regard to the safety of her sheer hose, and mounted to her own porch. She found her key, opened the door, and entered. As she ascended the stairs, her fit of temper at the doctor passed, and she felt lonely, weary, and unutterably miserable. She sank to a seat on the topmost step and gave herself over to bitter reflections. Nick was gone. The realization came poignantly at last. There would be no more evening rides, no more conversations whose range was limited only by the scope of the universe, no more breathtaking kisses, the sweeter for his reluctance. She sat mournfully silent and considered the miserable situation in which she found herself. In love with a madman, or worse, in love with a demon, with a being half of whose nature worshipped her while the other half was bent on her destruction. Was anyone, she asked herself, was anyone anywhere ever in a more hopeless predicament? What could she do? Nothing, she realized, save sit helplessly aside while Nick battled the thing to a finish. Or possibly, the only alternative, take him as he was, chance the vicissitudes of his unstable nature, lay herself open to the horrors she had glimpsed so recently, and pray for her fortunes to point the way of salvation. And in the mood in which she now found herself, that seemed infinitely the preferable solution. Yet rationally she knew it was impossible. She shook her head despondently and leaned against the wall in abject misery. Then, thin and sharp, sounded the shrill summons of the doorbell, and a moment later the patter of the maid's footsteps in the hall below. She listened idly to distract herself from the chain of despondency that was her thoughts, and was mildly startled to recognize the booming drums of Dr. Horker's voice. She heard his greeting and the muffled reply from the group, and then a phrase understandable because of his sonorous tones. "Where's Pat?" The words drifted up the well of the stairs, followed by a scarcely audible reply from her mother. Heavy footfalls on the carpeted steps, and then his figure bulked on the landing below her. She cupped her chin on her hands and stared down at him while he ascended to her side, sprawling his great figure beside her. "Pat, honey," he rumbled, "you're beginning to get me worried." "Am I?" Her voice was weary, dull. "I've had myself like that for a long time." "Poor kid. Are you really so miserable over this Nick problem of yours?" "I love him." "Yes." He looked at her with sympathy and calculation mingling in his expression. "I believe you do. I'm sorry, honey. I didn't realize until now what he means to you." "You don't realize now," she murmured, still with the weary intonation. "Perhaps not, Pat, but I'm learning. If you're in this thing as deeply at all that, I'm in too, to the finish. Want me?" She reached out her hand, plucking at his coat sleeve. Abruptly she leaned toward him, burying her face against the rough tweed of his suit. She sobbed a little, while he patted her gently with his great, delicately fingered hand. "I'm sorry, honey," he rumbled. "I'm sorry." The girl drew herself erect and leaned back against the wall, shaking her head to drive the tears from her eyes. She gave the doctor a wan little smile. "Well?" she asked. "I'll return your compliment of the other night," said Horker briskly. "I'll ask a few questions, purely professional, of course." "Fire away, Dr. Carl." "Good. Now, when our friend has one of these attacks, is he rational? Do his utterances seem to follow a logical thought sequence?"
"I think so."
"In what way does he differ from his normal self?"
"Oh, every way,"
she said with a tremor.
"Nick's kind and gentle and sensitive and naive, and this other is cruel, harsh, gross, crafty, and horrible. You can't imagine a greater difference."
Is the difference recognizable instantly? Could you ever be in doubt as to which phase you were encountering?"
"Oh, no. I can, well, sort of dominate Nick, but the other, Lord!"
She shuddered again.
"I felt like a terrified child in the presence of some powerful evil god."
"Humph! Perhaps the god's name was Priapus. Well, we'll discount your feelings, Pat, because you weren't exactly in the best condition for, let's say, sober judgment. Now, about this story of his. What happens to his own personality when this other phase is dominant? Did he say?"
"Yes. He said his own self was compelled to sort of stand by while the intruder used his voice and body. He knew the thoughts of the other, but only when it was dominant. The rest of the time he couldn't tell its thoughts."
"And how long has he suffered from these intrusions?"
"As long as he can remember. As a child he was blamed for the other's mischief, and when he tried to explain, people thought he was lying to escape punishment."
"Well," observed the doctor, "I can see how they might think that."
"Don't you believe it?"
"I don't exactly disbelieve it, honey. The human mind plays queer tricks sometimes, and this may be one of its little jokes. It's a psychiatrist's business to investigate such things and to painlessly remove the point of the joke."
"Oh, if you only can, Dr. Carl, if you only can."
"We'll see." He patted her head comfortingly. "Now, you say the kind, gentle, and all that phase is the normal one. Is that usually dominant?"
"Yes. Nick can master the other, or could until recently. He says this last attack is the worst he's ever had. The other has been gaining strength."
"Strange," mused the doctor. "Well," he said with a smile of encouragement, "I'll have a look at him."
"Do you think you can help?" Pat asked anxiously. "Have you any idea what it is?"
"It isn't a devil, at any rate," he smiled.
"But have you any idea?"
"Naturally I have, but I can't diagnose at second hand. I'll have to talk to him."
"But what do you think it is?"
she persisted. "I think it's a fixation of an idea gained in childhood, honey. I had a patient once," he smiled at the reminiscence, "who had a fixed delusion of that sort. He was perfectly rational on every other point save one. He believed that a pig with a pink ribbon was following him everywhere, downtown, into elevators and offices, home to bed. Everywhere he went, this pink ribboned prize porker pursued him."
"And did you cure him?"
"Well, he recovered," said the doctor noncommittally. "We got rid of the pig, and it might be something of that nature that's troubling your boyfriend. Your description doesn't sound like a precox or a manic depressive, as I thought originally."
"Oh," said Pat abruptly, "I forgot. He went to a doctor in New York, a very great doctor." "Munster?" "He didn't say whom, but this doctor studied him a long time, and finally came out with this fixed idea theory of yours, only he couldn't cure him." Horker grunted thoughtfully. "Do fixed ideas do things like that to people?" queried the girl. "Things like the pig and what happened to Nick?" "They might." "Then they're devils," she announced with an air of finality. "They're just your scientific jargon for exactly what Magda means when she says a person's possessed by a devil. So I'm right anyway." "That's good orthodox theology, Pat," chuckled the doctor. "We'll try a little exorcism on your devil, then." He rose to his feet. "Bring your boyfriend around, will you?" "Oh, Dr. Carl," she cried. "He's leaving. I'll have to call him tonight." "Not tonight, honey. Mueller would let me know if anything of that sort were happening. Tomorrow's time enough." The girl stood erect, mounting to the top step to bring her head level with the doctor's. She threw her arms about him, burying her face in his massive shoulder. "Dr. Carl," she murmured, "I'm a nasty, ill-tempered, vicious little shrew, and I'm sorry, and I apologize. You know I'm crazy about you, and," she whispered in his ear, "so's Mother." End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 18. Vanished. "He doesn't answer. I'm too late," thought Pat disconsolately as she replaced the telephone. The cheerfulness with which she had awakened vanished like a patch of April sunshine. Now, with the failure of her third attempt in as many hours to communicate with Nicholas Devine, she was ready to confess defeat. She had waited too long. Despite Dr. Horker's confidence in Mueller, she should have called last night. At once. "He's gone," she murmured distractedly. She realized now the impossibility of finding him. His solitary habits, his dearth of friends, his lonely existence, left her without the least idea of how to commence a search. She knew, actually, so little about him, not even the source of apparently sufficient income on which he subsisted. She felt herself completely at a loss, puzzled, lonesome, and disheartened. The futile buzzing of the telephone signal symbolized her frustration. Perhaps, she thought, Dr. Horker might suggest something to do. Perhaps even Mueller had reported Nick's whereabouts. She seized the hope eagerly. A glance at her wristwatch revealed the time as 10:30, squarely in the midst of the doctor's morning office hours, but no matter. If he were busy, she could wait. She rose, bounding hastily down the stairs. She glimpsed her mother opening mail in the library, and paused momentarily at the door. Mrs. Lane glanced up as she appeared. "Hello," said the mother. "You've been on the telephone all morning, and what did Carl want of you last night?" "Argument," responded Pat briefly. "Carl's a gem. He's been of inestimable assistance in developing you into a very charming and clever daughter, and heaven knows what I'd have raised without him." "Cain, probably," suggested Pat. She passed into the hall and out the door, blinking in the brilliant August sunshine. She crossed the strip of turf, picked her way through the break in the hedge, and approached the doctor's door. It was open. It often was in summertime, especially during his brief office hours. She entered and went into the chamber used as a waiting room. His office door was closed. The faint hum of his voice sounded. She sat impatiently in a chair and forced herself to wait. Fortunately, the delay was nominal. It was but a few minutes when the door opened and an opulent, middle-aged lady swept past her and away. Pat recognized her as Mrs. Lowry. some sort of cousin of the Brock pair. "Good morning," boomed the doctor. "Professional call, I take it, since you're here during office hours." He settled his great form in a chair beside her. "He's gone," said Pat plaintively. "I can't reach him." Grunted Horker helpfully. "I've tried all morning. He's always home in the morning." "Listen, you little scatterbrain," rumbled the doctor. "Why didn't you tell me Mueller brought you home last night? I thought he was on the job." "I didn't think of it," she wailed. "Nick said he had to make some preparations, and I never dreamed he'd skip away like this." "He must have gone home directly after you left him and skipped out immediately," said the doctor ruminatively. "Mueller never caught up with him." "But what'll we do?" she cried desperately. "He can't have gone far with no more preparation than this," soothed Horker. "He'll write you in a day or two." "He won't! He said he wouldn't! He doesn't want me to know where he is!" She was on the verge of tears. Now, said the doctor still in his soothing tones. "It isn't as bad as all that." "Take off your bedside manner," she snapped, blinking to keep back the tears. "It's worse! Whatever can we do? Dr. Carl," she changed to a pleading tone, "can't you think of something?" "Of course, Pat. I can think of several things to do if you'll quiet down for a moment or so." "I'm sorry, Dr. Carl." "But what can we do?" "First, perhaps Mueller can trace him. That's his business, you know." "But suppose he can't? What then?" "Well, I'd suggest you write him a letter." "But I don't know where to write," she wailed. "I don't know his address." "Be still a moment, scatterbrain. Address it to his last residence. You know that, don't you? Of course you do. Now, don't you suppose he'll leave a forwarding address? He must receive some sort of mail about his income, or estate, or whatever he lives on. Your letter'll find him, honey, don't you doubt it." "Oh, do you think so?" she asked, suddenly hopeful. "Do you really think so?" "I really think so. You would too if you didn't fly into a panic every time some little difficulty confronts you. Sometimes even my psychiatry is puzzled to explain how you can be so clever and so stupid, so self-reliant and so dependent, so capable and so helpless, all at once and the same time. Your Nick can't be as much of a paradox as you are." "I wonder if a letter will reach him," she said eagerly, ignoring the doctor's remarks. I'll try immediately." "I sort of had a feeling you would," said Horker amiably. "I hope you succeed, and not only for your sake, Pat, because God knows how this thing will work out, but I'm anxious to examine this youngster of yours on my own account. He must be a remarkable specimen to account for all the perturbation he's managed to cause you. And this Jekyll and Hyde angle sounds interesting too." "Jekyll and Hyde?" echoed Pat. "Dr. Carl, is that possible?" "Not literally," chuckled the other, "though in a sense. Stevenson anticipated Freud in his thesis that liberated the evil serves also to release the good." "But it was a drug that caused that change in the story, wasn't it?" "Well, do you suspect your friend of being addicted to some mysterious drug? Is that the latest hypothesis?" "Is there such a drug? One that could change a person's character?" "All alkaloids do that, honey. Some of them stimulate, some depress, some breed frenzies, and some give visions of delight. But all of them influence one's mental and emotional organization, which you call character. So, for that matter, does a square meal or a cup of coffee, or even a rainy day." "But isn't there a drug that can separate good qualities from evil, like the story?" "Emphatically not, Pat. That's not the trouble with this pesky boyfriend of yours." "Well," said the girl doubtfully, "I only wish I had as much faith in your psychologies as you have. If your brain doctors know it all, why do you switch theories every year?" "We don't know it all. On the other hand, there are a few things to say in our favor." "What are they?" "For one, replied the doctor. "We do cure people occasionally. You'll admit that." "Sure," said Pat. "So did the Salem witches occasionally." She gave him a suddenly worried look. "Oh, Dr. Carl, don't think I'm not grateful. You know how much I'm hoping from your help, but I'm miserably anxious over all this." "Never mind, honey. You're not the first one to point out the shortcomings of the medical profession. That's a game played by plenty of physicians, too." He paused at the sound of footsteps on the porch, followed by the buzz of the doorbell. "Run along and write your letter, dear. Here comes that Tuesday hypochondriac of mine, and he's rich enough for my careful attention." Pat flashed him a quick smile of farewell and slipped quietly into the hall. At the door she passed the doctor's patient, a lean elderly gentleman of woebegone visage, and returned to her own home. Her spirits, mercurial to a degree, had risen again. She was suddenly positive that the doctor's scheme would bring results, and she darted into the house almost buoyantly. Her mother had abandoned the desk, and she ensconced herself before it, finding paper and pen and staring thoughtfully at the blank sheet. Finally she wrote, "Dear Nick, something has happened, favorably, I think, to us. I believe I have found the help we need. Will you come, if you can, or if that's not possible, break that self-given promise of yours and communicate with me? I love you." She signed it simply Pat, placed it in an envelope, addressed it hastily, and hurried out to post it. On her return she spied the doctor's hypochondriac in the act of leaving. He walked past her with his lean, worry-smitten face like a study of Hogarth, and she heard him mumbling to himself. The elation went out of her. She mounted the steps very soberly and went miserably inside. End of chapter 18. Recording by Rebecca.
Chapter 19 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Begeman, Somerville, South Carolina. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 19. Man or Monster? Pat suffered Wednesday through somehow, knowing that any such early response to her letter was impossible. Still, that impossibility did not deter her from starting at the sound of the telephone and sorting through the mail with an eagerness that drew a casual attention from her mother. "Good heavens, Patricia! You're like a child watching for an answer to his note to Santa Claus." "That's what I am, I guess," responded the girl ruefully. "Maybe I expect too much from Santa Claus." Late in the afternoon she drifted over to Dr. Horker's residence to be informed that he was out. For distraction, she went in anyway, and spent a while browsing among the books in the library. She blundered into Kraft Ebing and read a few pages in growing indignation. "I'm ashamed to be human," she muttered disgustedly to herself, slamming shut the Psychopathia Sexualis. "I wouldn't be a doctor or have a child of mine become one if I were positively certain he'd turn into Lord Lister himself. Nick was right when he said doctors live on people's troubles." She wondered how Dr. Horker could remain so human, so kindly and understanding, when, as he said himself, his world was a parade of misfits, incompetents, and all the nastiness of mortals. He was nice. She felt no embarrassment in confiding in him, even when she might hesitate to bare her feelings to her own mother. Or was it simply the natural thing to do, to tell one's troubles to a doctor? Not, of course, that the situation reflected any discredit on her mother. Mrs. Lane was a very precious sort of parent, she mused, young as Pat in spirit, appreciative and enthusiastically fond of her daughter.
that she trusted Pat, that she permitted her to do entirely as she pleased, was exactly as the girl would have it. It argued no lack of affection, that each of them had their separate interests, and if the girl occasionally found herself in unpleasantness such as this, that too was her own fault. And yet, she reflected, it was a bitter thing to have no one to whom to turn. If it weren't for Dr. Carl and his jovial willingness to commit any sin up to malpractice to help her, she might have felt differently. But there always was Dr. Carl, and that, she concluded, was that. She wandered back to her own side of the hedge, missing for the first time in many weeks the companionship of the old crowd. There hadn't been many idle afternoons heretofore during the summer. There had always been some of the collegiate vacationing in town, and Pat had never needed other lure than her own piquant vivacity to assure herself of ample attention. Now, of course, it was different. She had so definitely tagged herself with the same Nicholas Devine that even the most ardent of the group had taken the warning. "And I don't regret it either," she told herself as she entered the house. "Trouble, mystery, suffering, and all, I don't regret it. I've had my compensations, too." She sighed and trudged upstairs to prepare for dinner. Morning found Pat in a fair frenzy of trepidation. She kept repeating to herself that 2 days wasn't enough, that more time might be required. And even had Nicholas Devine received her letter, he might not have answered at once. Yet she was quivering as she darted into the hall to examine the mail. It was there. She spied a fragment of the irregular handwriting and seized the envelope from beneath a clutter of notes, bills, and advertisements. She glanced at the postmark. Chicago. He hadn't left the city, trusting perhaps to the anonymity conferred by its colossal swarm of humanity. Indeed, she thought as she stared at the missive, he might have moved around the corner, and save for the chance of a fortuitous meeting, she'd never know it. She tore open the envelope and scanned the several scrawled lines. No headings, no salutation, not even a signature. Just Thursday evening at our place in the park. No more. She studied the few words intently, as if she could read into their bald phrasing the moods and hidden emotions of the writer. A single phrase, but sufficient. The day was suddenly brighter, and the hope which had glowed so dimly yesterday was abruptly almost more than a hope, a certainty. All her doubts of Dr. Horker's abilities were forgotten. Already the solution of this uncanny mystery seemed assured, and the restoration of romance imminent. She carried the letter to her own room and tucked it carefully by the other in the drawer of the night table. Thursday evening. This evening. Many hours intervened between now and a reasonable time for the meeting, but they loomed no longer drab, dull, and hopeless. She lay on her bed and dreamed. She could meet Nick as early as possible, perhaps at 8:30, and bring him directly to the doctor's residence. No use wasting a moment, she mused. The sooner some light could be thrown on the affliction, the sooner they could lay the devil, exorcise it, demon, fixed idea, mental aberration, or whatever Dr. Carl chose to call it. It had to be met and vanquished once and forever, and it could be vanquished. In her present mood she didn't doubt it. Then, after that, there was the prospect of her own Nick regained, and the sweet vistas opened by that reflection. She lunched in an abstracted manner. In the afternoon, when the phone rang, she jumped in a startled manner, then relaxed with a shrug. But this time it was for her. She darted into the hall to take the call on the lower phone. She was hardly surprised, but thoroughly excited to recognize the voice of Nicholas Devine. "Pat?" "Nick! Oh, Nick, honey, what is it?" "My note to you." Even across the wire she sensed the strain in his tense tones. "You've read it?" "Of course, Nick. I'll be there." "No." His voice was trembling. "You won't come, Pat. Promise you won't." "But why? Why not, Nick? Oh, it's terribly important that I see you." "You're not to come, Pat." "But—"
An idea was struggling to her consciousness.
Nick, was it—"
"Yes, you know now."
"But, honey, what difference does it make? You come. You must, Nick."
"I won't meet you, I tell you." She could hear his voice rising excitedly in pitch. She could feel the intensity of the struggle across unknown miles of lifeless copper wire.
"Nick," she said, "I'm going to be there, and you're going to meet me."
There was silence at the other end.
"Nick," she cried anxiously, "do you hear me? I'll be there. Will you?"
His voice sounded again, now flat and toneless. "Yes," he said, "I'll be there." The receiver clicked at the far end of the wire. There was only a futile buzzing in Pat's ears. She replaced the instrument and sat staring dubiously at it. Had that been Nick? Really her Nick? Or suppose she went to that meeting and found the other? Was she willing to face another evening of indignities and terrors like those still fresh in her memory? Still, she argued, what harm could come to her on that bench, exposed as it was to the gaze of thousands who wandered through the park on summer evenings? Suppose it were the other who met her? There was no way to force her into a situation such as that of Saturday night. Nick himself had chosen that very spot for their other meeting, and for that very reason. "There's no risk in it," she told herself. "Nothing can possibly happen. I'll simply go there and bring Nick back to Dr. Carl's along a lighted, busy street, the whole 2 blocks. What's there to be afraid of?" "Nothing at all," she answered herself. "But suppose—" She shuddered, and deliberately abandoned her chain of thought as she rose and rejoined her mother. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 20. The Assignation. Pat was by no means as buoyant as she had been in the morning. She approached the appointed meeting place with a feeling of trepidation that all her arguments could not subdue. She surveyed the crowded walks of the park with relief. She felt confirmed in her assumption that nothing unpleasant could occur with so many onlookers, so she approached the bench with somewhat greater self-assurance than when she had left the house. She sought a seat with its lone occupant and hastened her steps. Nicholas Devine was sitting exactly as he had on that other occasion, chin cupped on his hands, eyes turned moodily towards the vast lake that coruscated now, with the reflection of stars and many lights. As before, she moved close to his side before he looked up, but here the similarity of the 2 occasions vanished. Her fears were realized. She was looking into the red gleaming eyes and expressionless features of his other self, the demon of Saturday evening. "Sit down," he said as a sardonic half-smile twisted his lips. "Aren't you pleased? Aren't you thrilled to the very core of your being?" Pat stood irresolute. She controlled an impulse to break into sudden, abandoned flight. The imminence of the crowded walks again reassured her, and she seated herself gingerly on the extreme edge of the bench, staring at her companion with coolly inimical eyes. He returned her gaze with features as immobile as carven stone. Only his red eyes gave evidence of the obscene, uncanny life behind the mask. "Well?" said Pat in as frigid a voice as she could muster. "Yep," said the other, surveying her. "You are quite as I recalled you. Very pretty, almost beautiful, save for a certain irregularity in your features. Not unpleasant, however." His eyes traveled over her body. Automatically she drew back, shrinking away from him. "You have a seductive body," he continued. "A most seductive body. I regret that circumstances prevented our full enjoyment of it. But that will come. Yes, that will come." "Oh," said Pat faintly. It took all her determination to remain seated by the side of the horror. "You were extremely attractive as I attired you Saturday," the other proceeded. His lips took on a curious, sensual leer. "I could have done better with more time. I would have stripped you somewhat more completely. Everything, I think, except your legs. I am pleased by the sight of your long, straight, silk-clad legs, and should perhaps have received some pleasure by running those hands along them, scratching at proper intervals for the aesthetic effect of blood. But that too will come." The girl sprang erect, gasping and speechless in outraged anger. She turned abruptly. Nothing remained of her determination now. She felt only an urge to escape from the sneering tormentor who had lost in her mind all connection with her own Nicholas Devine. She took a sudden step. "Sit down." She heard the tones of the entity behind her, flat, unchanged. "Sit down, else I'll drag you here." She paused in sheer surprise, turning a startled face on the other. "You wouldn't dare," she said, amazed at the bald effrontery of the threat. "You don't dare touch me here." The other laughed. "Don't I? What have I to risk? He'll suffer for any deed of mine. You'll call for aid against me and only lose the hounds on him." Pat stared blankly at the evil face. She had no answer. For once her ready tongue found no retort. "Sit down," reiterated the other, and she dropped dazedly to her position on the bench. She turned dark, questioning eyes on him. "Don't you see?" he sneered. "How weakening an influence is this love of yours? To protect him you are obeying me. This is my authority over you. This body I share with him." She made no reply. She was making a desperate effort to lash her mind into activity, to formulate some means of combating this being who tortured her. "It has weakened him, too," the other proceeded. "This disturbed love of his has taken away the mastery which birth gave him, and his enfeeblement has given that mastery to me. He knows now the reason for his weakness. I tell it to him too late to harm me." Pat struggled for composure. The very presence of the cold demon tore at the roots of her self-control, and she suppressed a fierce desire to break into hysterical laughter. Ridiculous, hopeless, incomprehensible situation. She forced her quivering throat to husky speech. What are you?" she stammered. "Synapse. I'm a question of synapses," jeered the other. "Simple. Very simple. Ask your friend, the doctor." "I think," said the girl, a measure of control returning to her voice, "that you're a devil. You're some sort of fiend that has managed to attach itself to Nick, and you're not human. That's what I think." "Think what you please," said the other. "We're wasting time here," he said abruptly. "Come." "Where?" Pat was startled. She felt a recurrence of fright. "No matter where. Come." "I won't. Why do you want me?" "To complete the business of Saturday night," he said. Your lips have healed. They bleed no longer, but that is easy to remedy. Come. I won't! Exclaimed the girl in sudden panic. I won't! She moved as if to rise. You forget, intoned the being beside her. You forget the authority vested in me by virtue of this love of yours. Let me convince you. He stretched forth a thin hand. Move, and you condemn your sweetheart to the punishment you threaten me. He seized her arm, pinching the flesh brutally, his nails breaking the smooth skin. Pat felt her face turn ashy pale. She closed her eyes and bit her nearly healed lips at the excruciating pain. But she made not the slightest sound nor the faintest movement. She simply sat and suffered. You see, sneered the other, releasing her. Thank my kindly nature that I marked your arm instead of your face. Shall we go? A scarcely audible whimper of pain came from the girl's lips. She sat pallid and unmoving, with her eyes still closed. No, she murmured faintly at last. No, I won't go with you. Shall I drag you? Yes, drag me if you dare. His hand closed on her wrist. She felt herself jerked violently to her feet, so roughly that it wrenched her shoulder. A startled, frightened little cry broke from her lips, and then she closed them firmly at the sight of several bypassers turning curious eyes on them. I'll come, she murmured. The glimmering of an idea had risen in her chaotic mind. She followed him in grim, bitter silence across the clipped turf to the limit of the park. She recognized Nick's modest automobile standing in the line of cars along the street. Her companion, or captor, moved directly towards it, opened the door, and clambered in without a single backward glance. He turned about and watched her as she paused with one diminutive foot on the running board and rubbed her hand over her aching arm. Get in, he ordered coldly. She made no move. I want to know where you intend to take me. It doesn't matter. To a place where we can complete that unfinished experiment of ours. Aren't you happy at the prospect? Do you think, she said unsteadily, that I'd consent to that even to save Nick from disgrace and punishment? Do you think I'm fool enough for that? We'll soon see. He extended his hand. Scream. Fight. Struggle, he jeered. Call them down on your sweetheart. He had closed his hand on her wrist. She jerked it convulsively from his grasp. I'll bargain with you, she gasped. She needed a moment's respite to clarify a thought that had been growing in her mind. Bargain? What have you to offer? As much as you. Ah, but I have a threat. The threat to your sweetheart. And I'm offering, too, the lure of that evil whose face so charmed you recently. Have you forgotten how nearly I won you to the worship of that principle? Have you forgotten the ecstasy of that pain? His terrible bloodshot eyes were approaching her face, and, strangely, the girl felt a curious recurrence of that illogical desire to yield that had swept over her on that disastrous night of Saturday. There had been an ecstasy. There had been a wild, ungodly, unhallowed pleasure in his blows, in the searing pain of his kisses on her lacerated lips. She realized vaguely that she was staring blankly, dazedly into the red eyes, and that somewhere within her, some insane brain cells were urging her to clamber into the seat beside him. She tore her eyes away. She rubbed her bruised shoulder, and the pain of her own touch restored her vanishing logical faculties. She returned her gaze to the face of the other, meeting his gaze now coolly. Nick, she said earnestly, as if calling him from a distance. Nick! There was, she fancied, the faintest gleam of concern apparent in the features opposite her. She continued. Nick, she repeated, you can hear me, honey. Come to the house as soon as you are able. Come tonight, or any time. I'll wait until you do. You'll come, honey. You must. She backed away from the car. The other made no move to halt her. She circled the vehicle and dashed recklessly across the street. From the safety of the opposite walk she glanced back. The red-eyed visage was regarding her steadily through the glass of the window. End of chapter 20. Recording by Rebecca. Chapter 21 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 21. A Question of Synapses. Pat almost ran the few blocks to her home. She hastened along in a near panic, regardless of the glances of pedestrians she chanced to pass. With the disappearance of the immediate urge, the composure for which she had struggled had deserted her, and she felt shaken, terrified, and weak. Her arm ached miserably, and her wrenched shoulder pained at each movement. It was not until she attained her own doorstep that she paused, panting and quivering, to consider the events of the evening. "I'll just have to give up, I guess. I can't pit myself another time against that thing." She leaned wearily against the railing of the porch, rubbing her injured arm. Dr. Carl was right, she thought. Nick was right. It's dangerous. There was a moment there at the end when it, almost had me. I'm frightened, she admitted. Lord only knows what might have happened had I been a little weaker. If the Lord does know, she added. She found her latch key and entered the house. Only a dim light burned in the hall. Her mother, of course, was at the club, and the maid and Magda were far away in their chambers on the third floor. She tossed her wrap on a chair, switched on a brighter light, and examined the painful spot on her arm, a red mark already beginning to turn a nasty blue, with 2 tiny specks of drying blood. She shuddered and trudged warily up the stairs to her room. The empty silence of the house oppressed her. She wanted human companionship, safe, trustworthy, friendly company, anyone to distract her thoughts from the eerie, disturbing direction they were taking. She was still in somewhat of a panic, and suppressed with difficulty a desire to peep fearfully under the bed. "Coward," she chided herself. "You knew what to expect." Suddenly the recollection of her parting words recurred to her. She had told Nick, if Nick had indeed heard, to come to the house, to come at once, tonight, if he could. A tremor of apprehension ran through her. Suppose he came. Suppose he came as her own Nick, and she admitted him, and then... Or suppose that other came, and managed by some trick to enter, or suppose that unholy fascination of his prevailed on her. She shivered, and brushed her hand distractedly across her eyes. "I can't stand it," she moaned. "I'll have to give up, even if it means never seeing Nick again. I'll have to." She shook her head miserably as if to deny the picture that had risen in her mind of herself and that horror alone in the house. "I won't stay here," she decided. She peeped out of the west windows at the doctor's residence, and felt a surge of relief at the sight of his iron-gray hair framed in the library window below. He was reading. She could see the book on his knees. There was her refuge. She ran hastily down the stairs and out of the door. With an apprehensive glance along the street, she crossed to his door and rang the bell. She waited nervously for his coming, and, with a sudden impulse, pulled her vanity case from her bag and dabbed a film of powder over the mark on her arm. Then his ponderous footsteps sounded and the door opened. "Hello," he said genially. "These late evening visits of yours are becoming quite customary, and see if I care." "May I come in a while?" asked Pat meekly. "Have I ever turned you away?" He followed her into the library, pushed a chair forward for her, and dropped quickly into his own with an air of having snatched it from her just in time. "I didn't want your old armchair," she remarked, occupying the other. "And what's the trouble tonight?" he queried. I was just nervous. I didn't want to stay in the house alone." "You?" His tone was skeptical. "You were nervous? That hardly sounds reasonable, coming from an independent little spitfire like you. I was, though. I was scared. And of what? Or whom? Of haunts and devils? Oh, he nodded. I see you've had results from your letter writing. Well, sort of. I'm used to your circumlocutions, Pat. Suppose you come directly to the point for once. What happened? Why, I wrote to Nick to get in touch with me, and I got a reply. He said to meet him in the park at a place we knew, this evening. And you did, of course. Yes, but before that, this afternoon, he called up and told me not to. But I insisted, and we did. Told you not to, eh? And was his warning justified? Yes. Oh, yes. When I came to the place, it was the other. So, well, he could hardly manhandle you in a public park. Pat thought of her wrenched shoulder and bruised arm. She shuddered. He's horrible, she said. Inhuman. He kept referring to Saturday night, and he threatened that if I moved or made a disturbance, he'd let Nick suffer the consequences. So I kept still while he insulted me. You nitwit. There was more than a trace of anger in the doctor's voice. I want to see that pup of yours. We'll soon find out what this thing is, a mania or simply lack of a good licking. What it is, echoed Pat. Oh, it told me. Dr. Carl, what's a synopsis? A synopsis? You know perfectly well. I mean applied to physiology or psychology or something. He told me he was a question of synopsis. This devil of yours said that? Yes. The doctor's voice was musing. He frowned perplexedly, then looked up abruptly. Did he by any chance say synapses? Not synopsis. Synapses? That's it, exclaimed the girl. He said he was a question of synapses. Does that explain him? Do you know what he is? Doesn't explain a damn thing, snapped Horker. A synapse is a juncture, or the meeting of two nerves. It's why you can develop automatic motions and habits like playing the piano or dancing. When you form a habit, the synapses of the nerves involved are sort of worn thin, so the nerves themselves are, in a sense, short-circuited. You go through motions without the need of your brain intervening, which is all a habit amounts to. Understand? Not very well, confessed Pat. Humph. It doesn't matter anyway. I can't see that it helps to analyze your devil. I don't care if it's never analyzed, said Pat with a return of despondency. Dr. Carl, I can't face that evil thing again. I can't do it, not even if it means never seeing Nick. Sensible, said the doctor approvingly. I'd like to have a chance at him, but not enough to keep you in this state of jitters. Although, he added, a lot of this mystery is the product of your own harum-scarum mind. You can be sure of that, honey. You would say so, responded the girl wearily. You've never seen that change. If it's my imagination, then I'm the one that needs your treatments, not Nick. It isn't all imagination, most likely, said Horker defensively. I know these introverted types with their hysterias, megalomanias, and defense mechanisms. They've paraded through my office there for a good many years, Pat. They've provided the lion's share of my practice, but this young psychopathic of yours seems to have it bad. Abnormally so, and that's why I'm so interested. Apart from helping you, of course. I don't care, said Pat apathetically, repressing a desire to rub her injured arm. I'm through. I'm scared out of the affair. Another week like this last one, and I would be one of your patients. Best drop it, then, said Horker, eyeing her seriously. Nothing's worth upsetting you like this, Pat. Nick's worth it, she murmured. He's worth it. Only I just haven't the strength. I haven't the courage. I can't do it. Never mind, honey, the doctor muttered, regarding her with an expression of concern. You're probably well out of this mess. I know damn well you haven't told me everything about this affair. Notably, how you acquired that ugly mark on your arm that's so carefully powdered over. So, all in all, I guess you're well out of it. I suppose I am. Her voice was still wary. Suddenly the glare of headlights drew her attention to the window. A car was stopping before her home. There's Mother, she said. I'll go on back now, Dr. Carl. And thanks for entertaining a lonesome and depressed lady. She rose with a casual glance through the window, then halted in frozen astonishment and a trace of terror. Oh! She gasped. The car was the modest coupe of Nicholas Devine. She peered through the window. The doctor rose and stared over her shoulder. I told him to come, she whispered. I told him to come when he was able. He heard me. He or the other. A figure alighted from the vehicle. Even in the dusk she could perceive the exhaustion, the weariness in its movements. She pressed her face to the pane, surveying the form with fascinated intentness. It turned, supporting itself against the car and gazing steadily at her own door. With the movement the radiance of a streetlight illuminated its features. It's Nick! She cried with such eagerness that the doctor was startled. It's my Nick! End of chapter 21. Recording by Rebecca.